Hello everyone and welcome back to episode 120 of your favourite Formula 1 show. Yes, we're back this week. To be honest, we're not discussing the antics from the Canadian Grand Prix because it's been far too long and, you know, the dust has well and truly settled from that weekend. But I am joined by he's no longer actually McCheeseburger183. He's back from the US. To be honest, we were meant to start recording this 2.5 hours ago, but someone fell asleep.
Yes, the jet lag was hitting very hard this morning. So, not even jet lag, I'd just been awake for like 25 hours, so allow it. This time, yesterday, I was in Central Park, so you know what? Cut me some slack.
Okay, fine, I suppose. But yeah, we're back though. By popular demand then. We did kind of and ah about whether it was worth doing a Canadian Grand Prix recap, but we thought, the dust has settled. It was a good weekend from Circuit Gilles Villeneuve, but we thought, I've been reading through the comments and every single week one thing keeps coming up. When are we going to do part 2 of the F1 Iceberg? So we thought this is obviously, I think, the penultimate break week before the summer break. So we were like, we'll jump in, we'll do another Iceberg for a little bit of fun. So of course there'll be a link down in the description below if you want to go check out the Iceberg that we're using. But I think we've got about 11 things to go through today. Of course there'll be timestamps linked down below as well. But Jamie, where do you want to kick this one off?
Where do we want to start? Well, the first thing on there is something that isn't even English, so I guess that'd be an okay place to start.
I'm guessing you're referring to Hoje Nao, aren't you?
Hoje Nao, which
yes.
is definitely not how you pronounce it, I'd imagine. But this is Portuguese. It's definitely not English, and it's Portuguese because it was a Brazilian commentator for the 2002 Austrian Grand Prix, which race is famous. For the what was it called?
Let Michael through for the championship.
Let Michael pass for the championship. Yeah. And do you want to tell us more?
So basically, obviously, I mean, this was one that we looked on there and we were like, we have no idea what Hoje Nao is. But it was, as Jamie said, a Brazilian commentator by the name of Kleber Mercado. I'm probably butchering his name as well, because again, neither of us are Portuguese. But he was the Brazilian commentator for the 2002 Austrian Grand Prix. I think he's still around Formula 1. I mean, doing my research for this, I saw an interview with him just a couple of months ago. And he was the commentator for the 2002 Austrian Grand Prix on Brazilian TV. And from what we gather from a loose translation, it basically just means he was obviously just yelling as they crossed the line going, "This is a robbery, this is a robbery." And apparently it is still quite a big deal in Brazil, this race. I mean, it was massive news for a long time, of course, and the ramifications that followed it as well, wasn't it, Jamie? Team orders were banned until Ferrari again broke that rule in 2010 Hockenheim. But that was a massive, massive storyline at the time, wasn't it? And arguably still, considering it was an in-race, it wasn't like a championship style controversy.
And it was in a season that had no real jeopardy. It didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things outside of that one race.
No, I mean, this was obviously what a lot of people said, wasn't it? Michael had no need to win that race. I think he went from a 22 to a 26 point lead in the championship. This was at a time when there were 10 points for a win anyway, so it was absolutely dominant out front anyway.
And Ferrari had easily the fastest car, so there was no way he was going to lose to anyone other than Barrichello if he put together a championship. But obviously that wouldn't have happened. So, especially not when they took his win away. But I don't think this is that spicy. It's just a bit of team orders when team orders are allowed. And it's a funny commentary line because Brazilians are super passionate about F1, obviously. And Barrichello was a massive deal at the time. So I understand why the commentator was annoyed and the Brazilian fans might be annoyed. But team orders were allowed at the time. And this sort of thing happens every week now, really.
I think every week is a bit strong.
I suppose the race wins, it's not common.
It was more how blatant it was, though, wasn't it? I think at the time that was so upsetting. Yeah. But what is often forgotten about as well, and I don't know, we still don't really know for sure to this day, do we? But of course, Michael, a couple of races later, let Rubens Barrichello win the 2002 US Grand Prix, didn't he?
Wasn't it?
Still not known whether he was just trying to stage a photo finish or whether he actually wanted Rubens to win.
He was trying to give it back.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, you say that as the Schumacher fanboy of the group. I'm not so
Yeah.
convinced. But I mean, yeah, I really like Rubens Barrichello. I think he's one of the best personalities ever to come through Formula One. I'll be
Didn't his
honest,
son
Jamie.
take you out on iRacing once?
His son did take me out on iRacing once, so I like Rubens. Don't like his kids. But yeah, I mean, I must admit, I do occasionally still go back now and watch. There's a famous couple of interviews that he did with Eddie Jordan, if you remember, back when he was going to retire at the end of 2011. They are absolutely brilliant watch as well, where Eddie goes to his house and is like swimming in his pool and that kind of thing. But yeah, Rubens Barrichello, one of my personal heroes from Formula One as well. Absolutely love myself a bit of Rubens. Are we going to go left to right? Are we going to go up and down, Jamie? What are we thinking?
Right. Read it as you'd read a book.
Okay, so Mercedes Monza tyre pressure then.
Yes. This one isn't that long ago. We weren't sure what it was talking about until we Googled, and it turns out to be, as far as we know, the 2015 Italian Grand Prix, which Lewis Hamilton actually got the perfect weekend, which we're seeing. I don't know, my Instagram's full of it at the minute because everyone's like, Max has never topped every session of every quali and practice all weekend and led every lap. Hamilton did it once in the 2015 Monza race. So I see a lot of it through that, but this race was thrown into jeopardy towards the end when what was Hamilton? Bono, his engineer, came on the radio and was like, he's leading by about 17 seconds at this point, and the team are like, you need to make the gap 25 seconds or 20 seconds, I think it was, towards the end of the race. So he was basically doing quali laps when the race was in the bag, and they wouldn't tell him why, and he was a little bit perplexed at first, but because of the dominance of the Mercedes, especially at Monza in 2015, he was able to do it. And he was annoyed. He said, "What? That's not cool, man," on the radio at the end. But he won the race, and it turns out he didn't get a penalty. The reason they thought was because they saw in the telemetry that their tyre pressures were too low, I think by 1.5 psi. So they thought there could have been a potential penalty when the FIA found that after the race. Turns out there wasn't. I'm not sure why there wasn't, but I guess even if there was a penalty, it wouldn't have mattered because, you know, he got the gap anyway from Sebastian Vettel in second and Felipe Massa on his last ever podium. Was it? No, he got a podium in Brazil as well, didn't he, that year? So yeah, there you go.
I was going to say, I thought that was the last race Williams got a double podium up to this point in Formula One. The 2015 Italian Grand Prix.
No, Vettel was definitely second.
Was Vettel definitely second? Was it? Okay, I was wrong about that.
Well, I'll check. But
maybe that was 2016 then that I'm thinking of. I mean, it's not really relevant, but still.
Neither got a podium in 2016.
What happened to Rosberg that Grand Prix then, Jamie?
He was running second and then got an engine failure with 2 laps to go.
Fair enough. Okay.
But because it's not Hamilton's unreliability, no one talks about it.
Well, it's because Rosberg was dog poo in 2015 anyway, wasn't he?
Well, he would have been like 30 points off, and it went to 55 after that race.
I mean, going into that's always what makes me laugh, isn't it? When we look at the 2015 Formula One season, because I mean, we rank it as a pretty dead year in Formula One anyway. But it was the fact that going into the US Grand Prix where Hamilton can win the title, it was actually over Seb rather than Nico, which still to this day is absolutely wild. Unreliability
was crazy for Rosberg that season.
Yeah, just like it was for Hamilton in 14 and 16. Didn't stop him carrying himself
Hamilton
into championship
one
contention.
In 2016.
Was it only one?
One retirement in a race, yeah. Well,
two, yeah. I was going to say
because one of them he crashed into Rosberg, but that's
Well,
not.
Rosberg crashed into him. But I'm sure that's on here at some point in the future.
We've just gone completely off topic.
Did you confirm the podium? Sorry.
Yes, it was Vettel.
It was Vettel. Okay, so it might have been 2016 then. That was Williams' last double podium.
No, definitely not.
But anyway,
only got one all year in 2016.
Oh, okay, there we are.
Rubbish.
Andrea Moda then, Jamie. I mean, we could do a full podcast about this at some point in the future. I mean, we've spoke about it behind the scenes. We have ummed and ahed about, you know, during the winter or on other races, whether we could do like an off-topic, old-school style podcast where basically, I mean, we ramble about Formula One anyway, but where we ramble about old-school Formula One. So, for those of you that don't know, Andrea Moda is famously the worst Formula One team of all time, set up by a Italian shoemaker, and of course this was back in the late 80s, early 90s when Formula One kind of got a bit ridiculous, but in a very different way. As in, anyone, like, Formula 1 cars at that point were dirt cheap to make, and you could kind of let a lot of, like, the cars were quite basic before, like, the technology age came, of course, in the early 90s with the Williams and things like that. So, pretty, like, Jamie and I now, sensibly, could probably set up a knowing wheel Formula 1 team back then and show up with a car. It was woefully underpowered, woefully dangerous as well, and the worst Formula 1 team of all time, pretty simply.
Yeah, they entered 9 races.
Yes, yeah.
Only had one entry because pre-qualifying was a thing back then.
Yep.
They basically never pre-qualified.
Nope.
They also didn't pay the FIA the $100,000 it cost to register yourself for the race before the first race.
Mad, isn't it? The fact
so
that
they both got excluded.
you could go to a Formula 1 weekend with $100,000 to buy in, and now it's $600 million and looks to be up to like $1 billion soon. Nuts. Absolutely nuts.
Crazy.
Mercedes 2012 rear wing then, Jamie. You were a fanboy of Mercedes back then. Talk me through it.
I was just a Schumacher fan and a Rosberg fan, I guess.
Exactly. You were a fan of Mercedes.
Basically, they found a loophole, as all technical revolutions happen like that. They found a loophole in the regulations which allowed them to basically have a double DRS, as in the rear wing would open in 2 places, which was a bit crazy, considering DRS was only a year old at this point, so it was still quite new. It was somewhere around the bottom half of the rear wing, like in the diffuser. Another flap opened, and somehow that was allowed, even though moving body parts are definitely not allowed outside of DRS.
Moving body parts?
Well, moving parts of your car is properly not allowed unless it's DRS, pretty much. But they somehow found a loophole. Ross Brawn was obviously there at the time, and it really boosted them at the start of the season, especially in qualifying, because at the time you could use DRS everywhere in qualifying, which is insane.
I forgot about that, yeah. Good times.
So
everywhere apart from the Monaco Tunnel.
Yeah, which is funny, because Schumacher actually got pole that day without the DRS in the tunnel. So, yeah, it helps Mercedes a lot. 2011 was a really bad year for Mercedes. I think they finished 5th or 6th in the championship. And then
I thought it was 4th still.
No,
I could be wrong, but I thought they was
Renault
4th.
All year.
Yeah.
Maybe it could have been 4th, but it was 4th or 5th. And then 2012 came along, and they were suddenly... I mean, it was an insanely tight grid in 2012. It was, especially at the beginning, it was ridiculous. They got pole, a front row lockout in China, which probably, well, at the time had the longest straight in F1. I think maybe not. Maybe India was longer.
It was right up there, yeah.
It was right up there, and obviously DRS helped a lot on a 1 point whatever kilometre straight. And Rosberg did get pole. Schumacher got 2nd place, and then would have had a 1-2 if they fit all his tyres properly. So, but Rosberg did win. So, yeah, I guess DRS. It was kind of like outlawed for 2013, but 2012 they kind of just left him to it. And I think a few other teams kind of cottoned on. But at the start of the year, especially, it was very much a controversy.
Yes, yeah. I mean, 2012 was obviously a really weird year for Mercedes generally, wasn't it? Of course, like you mentioned, 2010 they kind of came in, done all right. 2011 then, like I said, I'm pretty certain they still finished P4 in the Constructors' Championship. But obviously they were further away from the front runners. And I know I've read an interview recently, obviously, when they were talking about like 2012 for Mercedes. That was basically make or break for them. Because, of course, they realised now they were actually going to have to spend a lot of money developing a car if they wanted this to be a worthwhile venture. And it was kind of... Had Shanghai not happened that year, it's likely the rest of the decade would have been completely different in Formula 1. Because Mercedes very easily could have pulled out from the sport.
Seb would have been a 10-time champion.
Seb could have won. Well, he wouldn't have been 10-time because Ricciardo beat him a couple of times and stuff. Ricciardo would have been the 2-time world champion. Seb would have had 5 or 6. Max would already be on about 4 as well, which is absolutely nuts to think about. But yeah, weird times, Jamie. Can you remember as well the famous quote from that Grand Prix when Schumacher broke down?
Oh, yeah. I've not been this disappointed since Shrek 2, wasn't it?
A Martin Brundle classic.
Which I watched. As well. Fun fact: I watched Trek 2 on the plane that I was on last week, and it's actually very good. It's better than Trek 1. So Martin Brundle has L opinions.
Fair enough. Martin Brundle is wrong about Shrek, apparently. McLaren's second brake pedal then, Jamie. We've got a lot of older school ones throughout the rest of this, haven't we? From our generation and earlier.
I know nothing about this, so you can take us away.
So, there's still a little bit of uncertainty around actually where this originated from, even to this day. But basically, McLaren... So obviously, you've got your normal road car. You've got your clutch, your brake, your throttle. On the other side of the clutch... in the McLaren back. Actually, they probably didn't have a clutch then, of course, because Formula 1 cars didn't at that point. So where the clutch would be, was a second brake pedal that was used. So it would change each weekend, depending on obviously whether the track was clockwise or counterclockwise. I don't know what they did at Suzuka, before you ask. And it basically meant that what you do is you'd obviously use your brake. You obviously in Formula 1 you right foot brake. Sorry, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, right foot brake. This was the thing. You were still having to right foot brake in this car. That's what confused me then for a second. And what you do is you then use your left foot on this secondary brake pedal that would only brake on the inside rear wheel. Of course, that then would mean it would rotate slower and allow the outside wheel to rotate faster around it, creating better turning circles for the car. Now, obviously, the big thing that was so fascinating about this and why it's so well remembered to this day, of course, was the fact that to find it's something ridiculous, like to find a quarter of a second in Formula 1 cost £10 million. McLaren, they reckon this found them anywhere from about half a second to a second, and it cost them £50 to build.
That's insane.
And it was only ever found out... Sorry, carry on.
I was going to say, they didn't actually do that well.
It helped.
This is 1997.
This was the thing, though. It was only discovered in 98 after they'd started winning more races again. But yeah, it was only discovered because a photographer took a picture inside the cockpit of David Coulthard's car at the Melbourne Australian Grand Prix, even, I should say. So that was the only way it was ever found out originally.
Wow, there you go.
A fantastic little piece of ingenuity.
It seems like you must lose time by having to right foot brake, though, surely.
Not back then, because all the drivers would have come up through junior stuff still having a right foot brake.
Yeah, I guess. Fair. Wow. Bit of engineering. Was Adrian Newey at the team at that point at McLaren?
He was in the process of joining, but he wouldn't have been there. Yeah, no, he would have. But I don't know whether he would have had an impact on this directly.
Fair.
Because, of course, he came in 97, didn't he?
Good engineering from McLaren, which is rare in Formula 1.
Yeah, something we don't say nowadays. I mean, most of these, between now and the end, have got something to do with McLaren, don't they? Which is kind of weird.
Specifically the next one.
Especially with the next one, Jamie. I mean, this is one we could do a whole podcast on, isn't it?
Yeah.
Probably, would we still argue to this day, top 3 biggest F1 controversies?
Probably, yes. I would probably argue the biggest, certainly modern day.
I would suggest now that Abu Dhabi is bigger, just because of everything else going on around Formula 1.
But I guess that wasn't so much really a controversy, more like a mistake from the FIA.
You can't try to say that's not a controversy,
Well,
Jamie.
I guess it is. Okay. But this was between the two biggest teams at the time. And it was huge, like, front page news. It kind of...
It was world news
up.
in the same way that Abu Dhabi was world news, wasn't it?
Yeah, I guess. And Spygate then, 2007, take yourself back there to... it all blew up around Belgium, didn't it? It was the summer break between Hungary and Belgium in 2007, which had Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton driving for them, and Pedro de la Rosa as a third driver, who was also weirdly involved. I don't know why. But basically... a guy called Mike Coughlin, who was a senior engineer at McLaren, was handed some blueprints for the 2007 Ferrari car, which is obviously not allowed. And he basically, sold them, as far as to Nigel Stepney, who was...
you've got that wrong.
I'm getting this wrong. Nigel Stepney's Ferrari guy.
Do you want me to have a look through? So, Nigel Stepney was a Ferrari employee and was very hands-on in the team throughout the late 90s and early 2000s. So, of course, he was British-born. He was living out in Italy. All this, that, and the other, was very, very, progressing inside Ferrari, and of course, this was through their dominant years as well. He had a firm belief that he should have been the top dog inside Ferrari, of course. Obviously, when we saw Ross Brawn leave, when obviously we saw this big shift away from the Brawn, Todd, Schumacher era, he kind of felt he was going to slot into that top role. Was made very clear to him, and again, you still don't really know to this day whether it's because he simply wasn't Italian or what. But that was not going to be the case, and in fact, he was so disgruntled. Originally, he put chemicals in their engine when the car was back at Maranello. Of course, this then caused a huge stir inside Ferrari. I mean, they got the police involved. Like, this was how big a thing it is in Italy, because Ferrari are pretty much up there with the Pope. So he was then in sort of a bid to not completely destroy Ferrari from the inside. He basically was allowed to stay with the team, but he was no longer allowed to go to Grand Prix. He was put into a new role that meant he was at the factory all the time, and he hated that. So his plan was originally he went round, and this is often the bit that's forgot about this story as well that I love. He went to Toyota with this information as well, but Toyota wanted nothing to do with it. It's often forgotten that Nigel Stepney tried to go to Toyota with this as well, because everyone remembers, of course, it was Ferrari versus McLaren in terms of budget. Toyota was spending more money than both of them at this point.
Toyota was spending more money than anyone else, and just not making anything good.
Exactly, they were just throwing money at everything without solving anything. Again, another podcast we could do. So he went to Toyota with this information. They weren't interested. So of course he sent it over to McLaren and his good friend Mike Coughlin, who took it to a Woking photocopier, like a Staples, Jamie, back in the day.
That's funny.
And unfortunately for him, the employee that worked at that Staples was quite a big Ferrari fan. So he pretty much went straight to anyone he could email at Ferrari going, I've got all this information about your car. I know a bit about Formula One. Should anyone else have this information, especially in the UK? And that's kind of where this whole thing exploded from, didn't it? And there were just so many nuances to this, of course, because the big problem with it, wasn't it, was, of course, we had this mega battle going on between Raikkonen, Alonso and Hamilton. McLaren were already imploding by this point.
Oh, yeah.
Of course,
Hungary was awful for both. Like, qualifying at Hungary, Hamilton blocked Alonso on an outlap, and Alonso retaliated by blocking Hamilton in the pit lane, which meant Hamilton didn't get time to do a lap at the end of the session. Alonso gets disqualified. Ron Dennis is fuming. Hamilton goes on to win the race. So, yeah, there was already like chaos and implosion at McLaren, but yeah, this was definitely blew it out of proportion massively.
Well, this was the problem, wasn't it?
They were so focused on like trying to beat each other that it ended up Kimi Raikkonen came out of nowhere and turned around a 17-point gap with 2 races to go, giving us 10 points for a win, and won the championship.
Yes, yeah, which I was going to come on to in just a minute. But of course, this was the big thing that kind of blew it all out of the water, wasn't it? At Hungary, of course, because after, Alonso and Ron Dennis had their whole big argument, obviously, about why he blocked Lewis, apparently, basically, Fernando Alonso turned around to him and went, I'm going to go to the FIA with all this information. Because, of course, he already had all this stuff that they knew about the Ferrari car. And Alonso,
he knew he wasn't going to stay next year.
Alonso knew he wasn't staying next year, so he was more than happy to try and play dirty with Ron Dennis.
There's a great interview with Alonso after the qualifying session when he's been disqualified from qualifying. And his grin is insane.
He knows at that point. I think Alonso felt at that point he had all the cards, didn't he?
That was the beginning of El Plan back in 2007.
Kind of, yeah. And I mean, obviously, then that meant, and obviously, like Jamie said, of course, it meant that Ferrari and Kimi Raikkonen were able to come back come the end of the year. Of course, McLaren outright banned from the Constructors' Championship that year. The drivers were allowed to keep their points solely for the fact there was a big title battle going on.
Yeah.
But still,
otherwise Raikkonen would have won it in like July. Exactly. But still, Jamie, the bit that I wondered there that you just mentioned, of course, was the fact that Raikkonen came back from 17 points. Did McLaren intentionally throw it away to get less of a penalty? No.
You
Hamilton
don't think that?
as a rookie.
He had a mechanical failure in Brazil that cost him.
Yeah, but the China one was all on him. He needed
The team left
one
him out
extra
on
point.
absolutely destroyed tyres for like 20 laps too long.
Yeah, but slowing down enough to not go into a gravel trap into the pit lane.
The tyres were bald, Jamie.
Still, shouldn't be doing it.
This is one of the things, isn't it? Because I know Hamilton obviously went years without talking about this whole saga. And then obviously, I think it was about 2018, 2019, wasn't it? He said obviously at the time he had no idea what went on. Now he does. And he said it will make for a fantastic chapter in his book one day.
Yeah, I can't wait for Hamilton's book. Was it 2017 where he was like, at the end of the year, he was like, you'll have to buy my book?
Yes, 10 years from now, wasn't it?
Yeah,
2027, the Lewis Hamilton book. That will be the read
Incredible.
of the decade, I think, in that regard. But of course, yeah, Mercedes handed the biggest fine in
McLaren,
sport. Sorry, McLaren even, yeah, of course, handed the biggest fine in sport history at the time. Mercedes, of course, because they had a stake in McLaren, had to pay, I think it was 45% of that fine as well, which is often forgotten about. But there's no evidence, actually, Jamie, to support they paid that full fine either. Which is why you wonder whether they deliberately threw away the rest of 07 to get a smaller fine. Like whether they come up with an agreement behind the scenes as well.
Interesting. Also, I didn't know this until I just read it right now. Whenever a McLaren driver won for the rest of the season, they weren't allowed to have a team member on the podium.
I did not know that either. That's fascinating.
Well, they only won once, so only Hamilton at Japan. But they just had no team member up there because they obviously were banned as a constructor.
They were, the constructor. It would just been Ferrari every week.
Yeah, that's so funny.
I mean, such a wild
time to be alive.
Wild time in Formula One. And
Fernando Alonso just is. He loves stirring the pot, and that was a very big pot to stir.
It was arguably, like we said, still one of the biggest pots of all time to stir. And that leads us on quite nicely, doesn't it, Jamie? Because, of course, after all the 07 controversy, I mean, we've said before, we could do easily, sensibly, we could do like a 20-hour podcast between 2006 and 2010. And another one that I'm sure we could spend hours on is 2008 Belgian Grand Prix, isn't it?
Yes. I've wanted to talk about this for about 2 years.
We have discussed doing a podcast just about this incident for so long.
Yes, indeed. And the situation, you've got Kimi Räikkönen running in second place in the Belgian Grand Prix 2008. Lewis Hamilton just behind. You've got 3 laps-ish.
First
3 or
place
4 laps
Kimi
to
was
go.
running.
Oh, yeah, Hamilton was going for a move, wasn't he? No.
Yes.
Oh,
Kimi was first, yeah. They were battling for the win.
Yeah, they were battling for the win completely. And Spa 2008, quite, I think, 5 races from the end of the season. You've got Hamilton, Massa, and at this stage, Räikkönen was still probably in it, just about. 3-way fight, and then Kovalainen the other McLaren, who's a bit rubbish. I guess Kubica as well was there too, because everyone else was just messing around in 2008 enough for BMW to be serious for a year. So, yeah, you've got this monumental battle. It's also started raining because it's Belgium, so why wouldn't it? And you've got these two. It's kind of like when it happened in 2021 Sochi, Norris and Hamilton, that kind of battle where they're just going at it corner for corner because it's raining and they're on the wrong tyres.
But Hamilton and Norris never really went wheel to wheel, though, did they? It was just Hamilton closing in on
every
him.
corner.
Yeah, this one was a proper battle, wasn't it?
Yeah, insanely good. But it came down to it going into the bus stop chicane. You had Räikkönen leading the race. Hamilton goes for it on the outside of the bus stop, and gets run out of road because he probably, by today's standards, is fully alongside enough to deserve some space. But back in those days, I didn't really care. So Räikkönen kind of forces him off. Hamilton just has to skip the chicane. Lets Räikkönen back through on the straight down towards La Source, turn 1. And because he's closer, having jumped the chicane, he then just sends it down the inside of turn 1. Gets it slowed down. It's a pretty good move. And takes the lead of the race. And there's nothing thought of it. They keep on battling. Eventually, Räikkönen completely crashes out of the race, I think, on the end of the same lap, maybe 1 lap later. And then Hamilton's just going to cruise to the win because it's Massa was in second. And then it's kind of just all hell breaking loose behind, really. I think you had both Toro Rossos. You had Alonso, Heidfeld, and one of the Red Bulls, I think, Mark Webber, maybe. Were all just the rest of the points, and they were all on top of each other on the wrong tyres, and then you had Alonso and Heidfeld pit for wets with 1 lap to go and make up 25 seconds on everyone, which was insanely good. But turns out Ferrari appealed, why wouldn't they, to the FIA, and Hamilton got the smallest penalty you could get at the time, which is where the crucial details lie, which was a drive-through penalty for leaving the track and gaining advantage, which I think he did do, because in a normal situation, you're never close enough to go for a move into La Source.
And I'm going to stop you there for 1 second. Because, Jamie, you just said the crucial information. I completely agree, of course. That was the smallest penalty you can give. What you forgot to mention there, though, was how much faster the McLaren car was that year on a dampening track. Because, of course, this was the last year with groove tyres in Formula 1. It was a bizarre year. Groove tyres, but no traction control still. So dry tyres actually stood a bit of a chance as tracks got damp. The McLaren car was so much better than the Ferrari car in those situations. As you saw going into the bus stop, for the fact Hamilton was able to brake so much later and get around the outside in the first place.
I still think, had he not, like, he was only close enough to send it based on the fact he would just let him back through. So I think he did gain an advantage, but we're not going to agree. And I don't think if we had 20 hours podcast, we still wouldn't agree.
I don't think we would. But this is the other thing I found quite interesting then that you mentioned, of course, with Raikkonen barging him off the road. I think what the big surprise was then was the fact that that wasn't generally the way. I mean, if you exclude Kubica versus Massa at the Japanese Grand Prix the year prior. It was the year prior, yeah. That generally wasn't the thing drivers did, though, was it? Barge each other off the road. Now, of course, the context around this, Kimi needed that win, didn't he? For any slim hopes of the championship. We actually spoke about this just before we did the podcast today. Kimi won 2 of the first 4 races that year and hadn't won again up to the Belgian Grand Prix at like round 13 of the year. He needed that win to stay any chance at the championship. Of course, he was also known as, you know, the master of Belgium as well at that point. So that was under pressure as well. Obviously, because you had Hamilton coming in these tricky conditions and absolutely giving him a run for his money. But, I mean, those last few laps, still, I'd argue to this day, some of the most ridiculous Formula 1 laps of all time. I mean, it's just quintessential late 2000s Formula 1.
Oh, yeah. It's iconic. Just the fact that Bourdais and Vettel were running 3rd and 4th with a lap to go.
Bourdais should have got a podium. Bourdais was on the podium with like 3 corners to go, wasn't he, still? Yeah. And came home 5th.
And then, he came home 7th.
It was 7th, wasn't it?
No,
yeah.
It was 7th, yeah. Yeah, because Heidfeld and Alonso both had full wets on and were literally gaining 5 seconds per corner on everyone. But Hamilton did win by 15 seconds, but then his drive-through penalty, when it wasn't served, they turned it into 25 seconds, which seems ridiculous for Belgium since it's a very short pit lane. But there we go, that's the FIA for you. So it ended up with Massa winning the race from Heidfeld with Hamilton in P3, which didn't end up affecting the championship, but very easily could have done, because that was 2008. So he lost it. He won it by a point.
Yes, and I mean this came back up recently, didn't it? Of course, when Massa was talking about whether he could get Singapore either overruled or removed from that championship, and obviously a lot of people were going, you know, you lost a few points there, but Lewis absolutely did here as well, wasn't it?
Well, and Silverstone, Massa just spun 16 times.
Exactly. That weekend was really the weekend where Massa. Well, yeah, I mean, this was the thing again with 2008, really bad. Wasn't it?
It was probably the worst championship fight in terms of quality of drivers. They both made so many mistakes.
At least, well, I think the worst of all time is probably a bit unfair. Remember Schumacher Villeneuve 97. But still, absolutely wild year of Formula 1. But of course, you know, you also had Hungary, for example, for Massa. Easy win up until 2 laps to go. So, I mean, Hamilton, of course, as we know, won that World Championship. Is that Glock? We all will know that story. But, Jamie, we were so spoiled when we were kids, weren't we? Like,
you can see why we became fans.
Formula 1 back then was absolutely wild. Absolutely
it was a lot of fun.
This one, though, dates back before us, though. The 1998 British Grand Prix Crashgate thing.
No, not
Talk
Crashgate.
me through this one.
That's a separate
Crashgate's a separate one, sorry.
Yeah, Silverstone 98 is the famous Schumacher serving his penalty in the pit lane after crossing the line to win the race. So he basically won the race through the pit lane. Because they gave him a penalty for overtaking Alex Verts, which is a blast from the past, under safety car conditions or under yellow flag conditions. And the FIA issued him with a 10-second penalty with 2 laps to go in the race without telling them, because there were 2 different things at the time, without telling them whether it was a stop-go or just a time penalty. So yeah, the rules in the 90s were very strange and convoluted. But basically, you could only give straight-up time penalties if the incident happened in the last 35 minutes of the race. And this
is such a
happened,
dumb rule.
Which is really dumb.
How do you know
stupid.
if there's 35 minutes left of a race is my problem with that.
Yeah. And then it turns out this incident was about 41 minutes before the end of the race. So the team really didn't know. They were left in the dark by the FIA. So they just played it safe and brought him into the pits to serve a 10-second stop-go if it was that penalty. Turns out the Ferrari pit box was after the finish line, so he didn't serve the 10 seconds in the race, but still lost a bit of time, through the pit lane entry, obviously. Turns out, it was all an absolute mess. The FIA did not know what they were doing. And they eventually said it was meant to be a 10-second time penalty, which Ferrari then appealed because it was not within the last 35 minutes of the race. The FIA were like, oh, yeah, it wasn't, whoops. Then they took it back, and then they just rescinded the penalty altogether.
Utterly bizarre.
So it was a steward's masterclass, and actually all of the steward panel resigned after that race, which is a bit wild, really.
I mean, it's still nuts. I know we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, the fact that we haven't got dedicated stewards for Formula 1, even now. And I mean, it's things like that, isn't it? That this was back when Formula 1 came up with rules that are like, there's clearly a loophole here somewhere, and it's just a matter of time, when rather than if this gets exploited. And of course, Ferrari, as you said there, kind of had to in the end. But yeah, just an utterly... I mean, obviously, we've all seen the footage, I'm sure, of Schumacher, Murray Walker commentating him as he comes down the pit lane.
Flag on the wrong side of the pit lane.
Yeah, it just... so weird. Formula 1, again... just such a bizarre sport. But that's why icebergs for Formula 1 work so well, isn't it?
There were 9 finishes that race, by the way.
9 finishes. That was pretty good for the late 90s.
Yeah, it probably was.
Well, Jamie, I hadn't actually spotted this one on the list, but I suppose we could have probably gone into this a minute ago then, isn't it? And that, of course, is Crashgate. Yeah.
Which is also one of the biggest controversies, which happened about 3 weeks after the last... No, a year and 3 weeks after the last one, didn't it? Of Spygate.
Well, a year and 3 weeks after Spygate. 3 weeks after Belgium.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure Crashgate is well documented. But we spoke about this in the first Iceberg, didn't we, with the Renault brake bias thing. Renault just, every so often, they do their best to try and get banned from the sport.
Yeah.
And this was their attempt this time round, was, to Singapore Grand Prix. They know their car is quick because it's said so in practice. It's the first ever night race in F1, which is quite cool. And, they got screwed over by a yellow flag in qualifying, so you had both of them out in Q1.
Alonso had an issue, mechanical issue.
Oh, was it an issue
in Q2? He was fastest in practice.
He qualified 16th on the grid, wasn't it? Because that's the lowest anyone on the current grid has won 15th. From, which is quite funny.
He qualified 15th.
Oh, 15th.
Because he was bottom of Q2.
Yeah. And then you had Nelson Piquet, who was very unpopular anyway, although he had taken the team's first podium of the year in incredibly lucky circumstances in Hockenheim.
Well, it was weird, wasn't it, Hockenheim? Because they got a really well-timed safety car for him.
And that basically inspired them.
He could get a podium. And, like you said, Renault saw that and went, well, why don't we just make a safety car happen?
It's so weird. It's just the French.
I mean, it's Flavio Briatore. That's what it is, isn't it? Like, have you ever... There's somebody in a fantastic documentary. He was basically in the mafia. Like, how on earth he was allowed control of a Formula 1 team is bizarre. Utterly bizarre. Carry on, sorry.
Completely. So you had this sort of prelude to it in Hockenheim where, Piquet qualified really low down. They put heavy fuel in the car because they had nothing to lose. a really well-timed safety car, and the safety car rules were dumb that year. They were just stupid, which meant you couldn't pit as soon as the safety car came out. You had to wait for everyone to train up into the snake, and then you could pit. So if you were going to run out of fuel in that lap it took to, because refueling was a thing back at this point, if you were going to run out of fuel in the time back then, you just had to pit and take a drive-through penalty with it. Which, interestingly, is what Nico Rosberg and Robert Kubica did this.
I knew you were about to mention Rosberg, because he could have probably won this race.
He should have won that race. But yeah, they saw in Hockenheim, Piquet vaulted from bottom 5 up into, could have won the race if Hamilton had slightly worse pace on a 2-stop. And then, they saw, oh, that works. Let's just do it ourselves. And then that's exactly what they did. So they pit Alonso a lap
12.
before. Yeah, lap 12 before the safety car came out. And then they told Nelson Piquet to crash. It just sounds ridiculous, doesn't it?
So dumb.
They told Piquet to crash in a way that would definitely cause a safety car, which he did very well in a very safe way. And then, cause a safety car. Everyone snakes up behind the safety car. They all come into the pits at the same time to refuel, apart from Fernando Alonso, who has played it like a
blinder,
yeah, and he's now leading. He's second place in the race behind Rosberg, who pit initially when the safety car came out and took the drive-through penalty, but because he was leading, he was trying to gap everyone before taking the penalty. So he did gap everyone apart from Alonso. Came out in second place after the drive-through, which left Alonso just to lead home the race win. Meanwhile, in that calamity, you've got Massa just leaving his box with a fuel pipe attached, which was very dangerous, and arguably costing the World Championship. But yeah, it was a crazy race, and it only came out a year later, and it's so funny watching back. What's his name? James something, the commentator.
James Allison.
James Allison is like, it's like ironic that Alonso only won because of his teammates' crash. It's like, oh yeah, it's very ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, mad, wasn't it? The odds of that happening.
Yeah, and then a year later, literally Singapore, the following season, 2009, they'd sacked Piquet for Romain Grosjean a bit before that, and Piquet basically went to the FIA and blew the whistle, and brought down everything Renault for a bit.
Well, basically for about another half a decade, wasn't it?
Yeah,
for Renault.
Yeah. So Flavio Briatore was banned. Pat Simmons was also banned, and Nelson Piquet received immunity in exchange for giving evidence.
Which always makes me chuckle for Nelson Piquet, because he was that bad. He wasn't going to get back in anyway.
Yeah,
it made no difference. I would put money on Flavio Briatore and Pat Simmons have been back to more Formula 1 Grand Prix than Nelson Piquet Jr. ever did.
Probably. Flavio's around a bit now, especially like Italy and Monaco, isn't he?
Yeah, Pat Simmons as well shows up from time to time. I mean, utterly bizarre, wasn't it? Like, we still don't know to this day, do we, whose idea it actually was. You know, whether it was Piquet's...
Alonso maintains he had nothing to do with it.
Alonso maintains he had nothing to do with it, and whenever he's been asked about it, that cheeky grin tells you a very different story. I mean, how did Alonso, every single controversy back in the late 2000s, he was pretty much in the centre of, apart from Belgium? Yeah. So bizarre, wasn't it? Of course, like we said, you know, that Renault were pretty much gone immediately. I think they were likely going anyway.
No, they stuck around for a few more years.
Well, they were Lotus.
No, they were only Lotus in 2012. They were Renault up until then.
I thought they would still have Lotus. I thought they were basically Lotus by 2010 anyway, weren't they?
Kubica and Petrov completely drove a Renault in 2010.
Oh, they did, didn't they? Yeah. Lotus in 2011, wasn't it? Yeah. Lotus Renault. Yeah, I suppose I was wrong there then.
But yeah, it was a mad time. And Renault, they actually won. Like, the funny thing was, they hadn't won in 18 months. Yeah. And then they completely script one race to win. And then 2 weeks later, they win again in Fiji without cheating. So they could have just waited and they won anyway.
Sorry, did you say Fiji or Fuji?
Sorry, Fuji. Fiji is its own country, isn't it?
The all-new Fiji Grand Prix.
It's jet lag, allow it.
Yeah, I mean, that is, like you said, the often forgotten bit about that was, the fact they did all that and then won a race too. Like, you must think there was someone there going, cock and balls. Like, how have we done this?
Yeah, because they were not going to win the championship that year. Although Alonso did score the most points in the last 6 races, partly down to Singapore, arguably.
Completely down to Singapore, arguably, because he screwed most of the big scorers.
Yeah, but they hadn't won in ages. Their main motivation for this was just to win a race, and then they won the next
on
race.
Board, wasn't it?
Yeah, and they won the next race anyway. So yeah, very funny.
Yeah, back-to-back race victories in 2008 for them, which again didn't actually happen that much that season. Felipe Massa won back-to-back races once. Hamilton won back-to-back races once, and then you look all the way down to Fernando Alonso, who won back-to-back races once as well. But it did help him beat Nick Heidfeld in the championship.
Yeah.
So every little helps and all that. Anyway, on to Yuji Ide.
You can talk about this one. I know nothing about the 90s.
You know nothing about Yuji Ide, do you? So, Jamie, cast your eyes back. 2006. Midland, a new Formula 1 team. Of course, out of the ashes that were Jordan the year prior. They have got, I think it was Asia Tech engines, I want to say this year, or they were sponsored by Asia Tech. And as we saw so often in the 80s and 90s, when Japanese manufacturers come into Formula 1 or Japanese suppliers, they want to get one of their own into the car.
Well, we still see it now, arguably.
It still happens now a little bit, I suppose, but Yuki Tsunoda's doing alright.
Yeah.
They wanted one of their own, and they pick up Yuji Ide, who'd been doing okay in Japanese junior formula. The problem was he just had a lot of money. But he, I think, remains still to this day, if I'm not mistaken, as the last Formula 1 driver to get their super license revoked. Because at the 2006 Imola Grand Prix, he famously flipped over another driver. I can't remember exactly who it was off the top of my head, to be honest. But yeah, he locked up going down in towards turn 2 and flipped. So actually, sorry, it wasn't Midland, it was Super Aguri.
It was Super Aguri.
It was Super. Yes. Sorry, I got me teams muddled up because I always forget Super Aguri existed as well in that weird period. But yeah, he managed to flip one of the other backmarket cars. I think he flipped the Midland, wasn't it? Sorry, of Christian Albers, I want to say.
Frank, well, no, that's who replaced him. Yes, it was Albers.
Yeah, he flipped Christian Albers at the start of the race. So had his super license revoked. He was woefully underprepared. He was woefully slow. Apparently, there were reports that he could barely communicate with some of the engineers. Because, again, this was a weird time where Super Aguri were like a half-hybrid Japanese and European English. BAR team. But it was just an absolute mess. And
he said to the FIA, I just read a quote, he didn't have enough testing because he doesn't understand how to use the car. Which is why the stewards strongly recommended to Super Aguri that they should remove him from the seat.
Yeah.
And Frank Montagny came in.
Yeah.
Who, he was equally as unexperienced, wasn't he?
Pretty much.
So, yeah, 7 entries all time. That was his debut when he replaced Yuji Ide. But I guess he would have tested the car a lot more. So, yeah, very, very weird time. Super Aguri are another one of those teams that are just like... They're so strange. But
so bizarre.
Takuma Sato did bits for them, and Anthony Davidson should have finished 4th in Canada one year. But
what I love still about Super Aguri is it was basically just Japanese propaganda for Takuma Sato. Yeah. Honda went, we're not hiring him anymore, and they were like, right, we're going to build our own team alongside him because we want him racing still.
Well, they already had Toyota anyway, so they were basically a mini Toyota because they took a lot of listed parts.
It was Honda though that were doing it.
Oh yeah, it was Honda, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Honda that were doing it. It was just, this was like, I mean, again, before the financial crash that completely crippled Japan, even to this day, really. There was still money flowing over there, but yeah, just, they wanted apparently as many Formula 1 teams as they could get their hands on, so built one and let their junior driver flip other cars around for a laugh. Blown Diffuser then, Jamie. This one's a bit more recent, isn't it?
This one's not that... It's not that spicy. It's just like a technical innovation. 2011, you had Red Bull, Adrian Newey, giving Sebastian Vettel his 2nd World Championship for the Red Bull RB7, I believe. It was that year. And most of that was down to the blown diffuser, which was basically blowing your exhaust gases in a clever way over the diffuser, which gave it an awful lot of downforce. And Red Bull weren't the only ones to do it. Renault also had, or Lotus Renault, I guess, at the start of the year, had their own blown diffuser,
Well, they had the side exhaust, didn't they, rather than the blown diffuser, which was equally as innovative.
It was very, very innovative. They actually kind of ummed and ahed about banning it midway through the season. You may remember Silverstone, where it's such a mess.
They temporarily
classic
banned it, didn't
FIA.
they?
Well, they banned it different levels throughout the weekend. Obviously, different teams had different cars. Going into the weekend, they said that you can't blow your gases anymore. You can't do exhaust gas blowing at all. And then Renault, who powered Red Bull at the time, appealed to the FIA saying, for safety reasons, we need to blow our exhaust gases by, it might have been 20%, I think. And the FIA were like, okay, sure. Obviously, this made everyone really annoyed because it's Red Bull getting an advantage over everyone else. Martin Whitmarsh and McLaren then went to the FIA and said, oh, we need to blow our engine by 50% for safety reasons. And they were like, okay, sure. I don't know why. But that meant that temporarily, McLaren seemed to have the big advantage. This is midway through the weekend. I think it was on Thursday or Friday at Silverstone, which I was actually at as a kid in qualifying, which is fun.
You were, yeah.
And then the FIA clamped down Friday evening and were like, okay, we realise we're idiots. We're going to go back to what we said. So Renault can have the advantage and Mercedes engines can't. No, I'm wrong. They said Renault can't have the allowance, but everyone else can, which was stupid and allowed Ferrari to win their only race of the season with Fernando Alonso. So it was the one time that Red Bull weren't just all conquering, really. I think Webber got pole. But the race pace, Hamilton and Alonso were both right there with the Red Bulls, which didn't really happen that much throughout the season. Vettel still finished second, and I think Webber was third. Yes, he was, because it was the team orders, wasn't it, at the end?
Yes.
And yeah, after this race, they basically reverted back to Valencia, which was the race before. They were like, we've made a mess of exhaust gases. You can just do what you want for the rest of the season. And then they outlawed them in 2012. So, yeah, it kind of all blew up in Silverstone. It was a mess. But it's what the FIA are good at.
It was what was always still to me bizarre about that still was the fact that Ferrari, it kind of felt like once they proved that they had the fastest, they'd actually developed the fastest car when you remove the exhaust gas whole thing. Once they took that win that weekend, they were like, well, clearly now we've got the fastest car. Like, we've proven that. We're not going to win the World Championship this year. You may as well let them use it again. Yeah. It's bizarre, because they probably could have won loads of races in the second half of the year.
Probably.
Had they gone, we want to keep this rule now.
I guess the closest challenger to Vettel at the time would have been Hamilton or Button, I believe.
Button that year.
But not at that point, because he had back-to-back DNFs in Silverstone and Hockenheim, didn't he? Or Silverstone
but he's still broken. Because remember, this was Hamilton's zombie year. I don't think it was Hamilton.
I'm going to check. British
I think,
GP.
I'm pretty certain it was Button and obviously Mark Webber. And Alonso might have been there or thereabouts.
After the race. Yeah, Webber was second.
Yeah.
Alonso third. Hamilton Button tied in fourth, yeah.
Oh, right.
So, I guess my intuition would tell me Alonso was like, I'd rather Vettel win the championship than open the door for a McLaren driver.
It's probably also true.
So it was like, we'll just bid it off and focus on next year, which he almost worked. So fair play.
Well, not by the car particularly. Probably not as reliable. But again, another wild time in the world of Formula One, and that brings us on then, Jamie, to our last technical innovation and our last topic of Tier 2 of the F1 Iceberg. That is the F-Duct.
Do you know about the F-Duct? I can talk about it if you want.
You can talk me through the F-Duct. I'll treat you.
Okay. So this is back in 2010, the dawn of a new era in Formula 1. You've got McLaren, you've got Ferrari, you've got Red Bull,
Mercedes
and
are back.
Mercedes are back. So there's big talk of 8-way championship fight with Michael Schumacher
winning his eighth.
Winning his eighth. That was going to happen, wasn't it? But then McLaren at the start of the season, especially on tracks with a lot of straight lines, are doing really well, and they're a bit confused as to why. But then footage starts emerging. I think it was Hamilton initially driving along with one hand on the steering wheel and one hand like pressed against the inner part of his cockpit. And the FA are like, what's this about? Why is he driving with one hand? It turns out they've got a thing called an F-Duct, which kind of is like pre-DRS in a way, because it basically there was no mechanical movement of the car, but it reflowed the air to make it go over the rear wing in a different way. So instead of making it go through the inside of the car as an S shape, it made it go through as an F shape, basically, which made it stall the rear wing. It made it have less drag on a straight, and you could take your hand off the F-Duct, and it would go back to being as grippy on the corners. So it's really, really clever technical innovation. And McLaren really reaped the benefits of it. I think Hamilton won in Canada and in Turkey. Button had won in 2 wet races at the start of the year as well. So yeah, it was really good stuff for McLaren. They were leading the championship, both championships after Canada, I think, with the 1-2 there. But sadly for them, they allowed it for the rest of the year, but it got outlawed in 2011. But as the season went on, more and more teams got their own F-Duct. I think Renault were the first to get their version, which is kind of why they banned it, because Robert Kubica drove up Eau Rouge one-handed. So it was quite crazy, but eventually Red Bull got the F-Duct, and that kind of put the nail in the coffin of them having the dominant car that year. And eventually, Vettel won the championship on the final race in Abu Dhabi when Alonso and Webber threw it away. So, yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, I mean, it was... Because if I remember correctly, though, I think McLaren's wasn't actually hand-operated.
I don't think... maybe it was a button on the wheel.
I think it was only when... I think it was the footage, wasn't it, of Fernando Alonso going down the main straight at Barcelona.
Yeah.
Where, of course, he's got one hand on the wheel. And I think it was Ted Kravitz, wasn't it, that asked him afterwards. He was like, so if you've got one hand over that, and one hand changed in brake bias on your steering wheel, what hand is controlling where the car's going? And they were kind of there like...
Shouldn't have asked that.
Which, was kind of the damning indictment, wasn't it, for the F-Duct? And of course, as you said, the inspiration for the introduction of DRS in 2011 as well. But yeah, again, a weird time, wasn't it, of course, because we went through the late 2000s where Formula 1 cars had all this stuff stuck to them. Obviously, in 2009, where everything was really simple with the exception of the double diffuser, and obviously 2010 again, as you said, everything started getting a little bit crazy again with all these innovations once more, because Ferrari and McLaren were actually fighting at the front again, and obviously
without cheating.
Yeah, exactly, without cheating. But again, I mean, most of this episode, hasn't it? It's been, late 2000s, early 2010s, and what a lot of stories. There was so much going on. So much going on around this time, wasn't there? It was nuts.
Oh, yeah, completely. And it's probably, it's the era we grew up on, so I guess we look back on it fondly. But, yeah, it's a great time to...
So much controversy.
If you haven't watched the season reviews, I'm not sure if they're still on YouTube, but they were at one point. If not, F1 TV, and then just watch the races. I mean, the races themselves were not all that, really, because...
No, it was a weird time, wasn't it? A lot of the races weren't that great, but everything that was going on in the bigger picture was mental back then.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
But is that going to wrap us up then, Jamie, for today's episode?
I believe it is.
Thank you all so much for watching, as always. Like we said, we'll probably be back maybe in the break week before Austria. Or after Silverstone even, or after Austria. I can't quite remember how the calendar... It must be after Silverstone, isn't it? We've got break week before the Hungaroring. We'll aim to try and return then with part 3 of our F1 Iceberg. Knowing our luck, by then something massive will have happened and someone will announce their retirement from Formula 1 as well. Max Verstappen. But yeah, thank you all so much as always for listening. If you have enjoyed, please do make sure you leave a like, get yourself subscribed, follow us on all our various social media bits as well. And yeah, we will return next week then with a preview for the Austrian Grand Prix. Another sprint weekend, Jamie.